The school auditorium was packed, every seat filled, every row tight with bodies shifting in cheap plastic chairs. It was that time of year again, the annual spring showcase, where students who could sing, dance, juggle, or tell jokes got their few minutes under the lights. Most kids saw it as just another school event, something to get through before heading to the diner for milkshakes, but for a few, it was everything. A chance to finally be seen, backstage. Tucked behind thick red curtains that smelled faintly of dust and old paint, a girl stood very still. She wasn't wearing sparkles or neon sneakers like some of the others. Just a plain white top, loose and soft, with simple black pants. Her hands were folded over a small wooden instrument, the kind nobody in this town had ever seen up close. It had buttons, a bellows on the side, and a warm, honey-colored finish. Her grandmother had brought it all the way from India decades ago. And now, it sat quietly in her arms like a secret. She'd practiced for months in her room. Late at night after homework, when the house was finally quiet, not because she wanted applause, she wasn't that kind of person, but because the songs lived inside her. They'd been passed down through her family like heirlooms, carried in voices before there were recordings. And since her mom had passed away the year before, the songs had become a lifeline, a way to feel close to someone who wasn't there anymore. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath. From the other side of the curtain, she could hear the MC wrap up the last actor group of juniors doing a surprisingly tight hip-hop routine. The crowd clapped politely, a few whistles cutting through. Then came the announcement. Next up, performing an original piece, please welcome Maya. No fanfare, no dramatic music, just her name, spoken plainly over the crackling microphone. Her stomach dropped. For weeks, she'd convinced herself she wouldn't back out. But now that the moment was here, every instinct screamed to turn around and walk back to the empty hallway, to disappear again like she always did. She had never been the center of attention. She sat in the back of class, answered only when called on, and never raised her hand unless she was 100% sure. Teachers knew her as the girl who turned in flawless essays but barely spoke during discussions. Classmates barely noticed her except maybe to borrow notes before a test. But tonight was different. Tonight she'd signed up deliberately, on purpose. She stepped forward, the harmonium held snug against her chest like armor, as the curtain parted. The stage lights hit her face bright and slightly warm, like standing in midday sun. She blinked, momentarily blinded. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw them. Hundreds of faces staring back. Parents with cameras, friends texting under the seats, teachers in the front row with crossed arms and polite smiles. Some kids were already slouching, half watching, waiting for something good to happen. Nobody leaned in. Nobody expected much. She walked to the center of the stage, set the harmonium on the small stool someone had placed there during rehearsal, adjusted the strap over her shoulder, looked down at her hands. They were shaking. A few seconds stretched too long. Someone coughed. A baby fussed in the back. A phone buzzed. She could feel the weight of their boredom, their impatience. It pressed against her like a wall, but then, from the third row, she saw her grandmother. Small, silver-haired, sitting perfectly upright, hands folded in her lap. Her eyes weren't just watching, they were holding her. In them was no judgment, no expectation. Just love, steady and quiet, like the flame of a candle in a window on a dark night. That look gave her the courage to begin. She placed her fingers on the keys, took one more breath, and started to play. The first notes were low and resonant, a gentle drone that filled the space like breath. Then, softly, she began to sing. The words weren't in English. They were in Urdu, a language almost no one in that room had ever heard spoken, let alone sung. It was a Sufi qawwali, an old devotional poem about longing, about love that survives even when the beloved is gone. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. But it was clear like water over smooth stones. And though no one understood the words, something in the tone reached them anyway. A sadness. A hope. A quiet strength that had been worn down by grief, but hadn't broken. At first, people shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged confused glances. A teacher raised an eyebrow. One boy in the front row turned to his friend and mouthed, "What's she singing?" His friend just shrugged, but then something changed. Maybe it was the way her voice rose slightly on the third line, trembling at the edge of control, or how her fingers moved over the harmonium with such care, as if each note mattered deeply. Or maybe it was just the sheer unexpectedness of it all, this quiet girl, this strange instrument, this ancient song in a room full of TikTok dances and pop covers. The fidgeting slowed. The texting stopped. Even the baby quieted. For the first time in a long time, the room wasn't thinking about themselves. They were listening, back in the wings. The drama teacher who had initially argued against including non-traditional performances stood with her arms crossed. But her expression had softened. The principal, sitting near the aisle, stopped checking his watch. In the second row, a girl who had never spoken to Maya outside of group projects suddenly sat up straighter. Eyes wide, and still Maya sang. She didn't look up much. She kept her gaze on the harmonium, on her fingers, on the floor. Not out of shyness now, but because the song was pulling her inward. Back to her childhood kitchen, where her mother would hum these same melodies while stirring rice or folding laundry. Back to the hospital room where she'd held her mother's hand and whispered this very song as the machines beeped slower and slower. This wasn't a performance for them. Not really. It was a promise to her mother, to her grandmother, to herself that she wouldn't let the music die. But the audience didn't know that. All they knew was that something real was happening in front of them. Not rehearsed perfection. Not flashy tricks. Just a human being, standing alone, offering something fragile and true, and that somehow was enough to make everyone lean in. Even the janitor, who had paused in the doorway with his mop bucket, stopped to listen. Outside, the evening sky turned deep blue, stars just beginning to blink awake. Inside, time seemed to slow. No one checked their phones. No one whispered. The only sounds were the soft wheeze of the harmonium, the rise and fall of Maya's voice, and the quiet hum of her room holding its breath. She hadn't planned to say anything beyond the song. But as she reached the middle verse, the part about walking through fire to find peace, her throat tightened. Her voice wavered. She tried to push through, but the note cracked. Not loudly, but noticeably. Like a crack in glass, she stopped. Silence dropped like a curtain. Her hands froze over the keys. Her heart pounded so hard she thought they could hear it from the back row. This was at the moment she'd feared. The stumble. The failure. The reason she should have stayed invisible, but instead of stepping back or apologizing, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the way her grandmother's eyes stayed locked on hers, unwavering. Maybe it was the realization that she'd already given them so much. Why hide the rest? She looked up, not at the ceiling, not at the lights, but right at the audience. "I haven't sung this since my mom died," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphone caught every word. "She used to sing it to me when I couldn't sleep." A collective inhale. Someone near the front sniffled. She swallowed, then continued, softer now. "I didn't think I could do it tonight, but I wanted her to hear it one more time." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. And then, quietly, she began again. This time her voice didn't try to be perfect. It just was raw, uneven, full of grief and love tangled together. And somehow, it was more beautiful than before. In that moment, she wasn't just a student performing. She was a daughter remembering, a granddaughter honoring, a girl learning how to carry loss without collapsing under it. And every single person in that room, whether they knew her or not, felt it when the last note faded into silence. No one moved. No applause. No cheers. Just a deep, shared quiet, like the kind that follows a prayer. Then, slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was her grandmother, and after a heartbeat, the whole room rose to their feet. But Maya didn't see that, not yet. She was still in the song, still in the memory, still holding her mother in the space between breath and sound. And for the first time in a year, she didn't feel alone. She hadn't expected this. She'd imagined walking off to polite silence, maybe a few awkward nods. Not this warmth, this sudden connection that felt like sunlight after months of gray clouds. Her throat tightened again, but this time not from grief. From something else. Something she couldn't name yet. She bowed quickly and turned toward the wings. Her legs felt like they didn't quite belong to her. Backstage, it was cooler, quieter, the noise from the auditorium muffled by thick curtains and concrete walls. She set the harmonium down on a folding table, her hand still trembling. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, trying to catch her breath. "You okay?" a soft voice asked. She opened her eyes. It was the stage manager, a senior she barely knew, who usually spent rehearsals chewing gum and scrolling through his phone. Now he was holding out a bottle of water, his usual smirk gone. She nodded, took the water, and managed a small thanks. He didn't walk away. That was... I don't even know what to say. I've never heard anything like that. She didn't know what to say either, so she just unscrewed the cap and took a sip. The water tasted like relief. Back in the auditorium, the MC was already introducing the next act, a magic trick with disappearing scarves, but the energy had changed. People were whispering, glancing toward the stage door, still buzzing. Some were pulling out phones, not to text, but to record the rest of the show like it suddenly mattered more. In the third row, her grandmother slowly lowered her hands. She wasn't clapping anymore, but her face glowed with a quiet pride that went deeper than any trophy or certificate. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photo, the same one she'd been holding earlier. It showed a younger version of herself standing beside a laughing woman with warm eyes and the same gentle curve to her smile as the girl on stage. The woman in the photo had sung this song too, every night without fail. And now, somehow, it had lived on. The rest of the showcase passed in a blur. There was a piano duet, a stand-up comedy bit that fell flat, a group of freshmen doing a surprisingly energetic K-pop dance. But the room never quite returned to how it had been before. People kept glancing toward the wings, as if waiting for her to come back out. Even the performers seemed a little quieter, a little more aware that something real had just happened in their midst. When the lights finally came up and the event ended, the crowd didn't rush for the exits like usual. Instead, clusters of students lingered in the aisles, talking in low voices. A few teachers stood near the stage door, not to supervise, but to wait. She didn't come out right away. She stayed backstage, helping crew members stack chairs and roll up cables, anything to avoid the attention. But it found her anyway. "Hey," someone said softly behind her. She turned. It was a girl from her chemistry class, someone she'd sat near all semester, but never really spoken to. Her eyes were a little red, like she'd been crying. "That song? Did you write it?" she asked. "No," the girl replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's really old. 100 years, maybe more." "My grandma died last winter," the other girl said, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to say goodbye." She paused. "But hearing you sing it made me feel like it's okay to miss someone and still keep going." The girl didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. "It's okay," she finally murmured. "It really is." More people came, slowly, respectfully. Not to take selfies or ask for an encore, but to say thank you. A boy whose brother was overseas in the military said the song reminded him of home. A teacher who'd lost her husband years ago squeezed her shoulder and said, "You gave us a gift tonight." Even the principal stopped by. Not with official praise, but with a quiet, "Your mother would be so proud." She didn't correct him. She just said, "Thank you." Aside, the night air was cool and smelled like spring-damp grass, blooming lilacs, the faint hint of rain. Her grandmother waited by the old sedan, wrapped in a light shawl. When she saw her granddaughter walk out, she didn't say anything at first. She just opened her arms. They hugged for a long time, longer than usual. No words needed. The kind of hug that carries everything. Grief, pride, memory, hope. On the drive home, neither spoke much. The radio was off. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the harmonium resting on the back seat. Wrapped in its cloth cover like something sacred, at home she went straight to her room. Not to celebrate, not to post anything online, but to be alone with the quiet, She sat on her bed, looked at the photo of her mother on the dresser, the same photo her grandmother carried. In it, her mom was holding her as a baby, both of them laughing at something off camera. She whispered, "I did it, Ma." And for the first time in months, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like an answer. The next morning, school felt different. Not because anything had changed in the building, the same lockers, the same squeaky floors, the same cafeteria smell of overcooked pasta, but because people looked at her differently. Not with pity, not with curiosity like she was a spectacle, but with a kind of quiet respect, like they'd glimpsed something real and didn't want to break it by staring too hard in homeroom. Her seatmate, who usually spent the first 10 minutes scrolling through memes, leaned over and said, "My mom saw the video." She cried, "Video?" She asked, confused. "Yeah, someone posted it last night. It's already got like 500 views. She didn't check it." Not then. She wasn't ready to see herself like that, raw and exposed, grief and all. But word spread fast. By lunch, kids she'd never spoken to were nodding at her in the hallway. A freshman shyly asked if she'd teach her how to say one line of the song. "It's beautiful," she said, "even if I don't understand it." At lunch, she sat with her usual Group 2 quiet friends who liked books and bad puns. They didn't make a big deal out of what happened. They just slid an extra cookie onto her tray and said, "You okay?" In that simple, honest way that meant more than any grand speech. But the real surprise came during music class. The teacher, Mr. Dahlia, man in his 50s, with a salt-and-pepper beard and a deep love for jazz, called her name after the bell. "Can I talk to you for a sec?" he asked. She nodded, heart-thumping. Had she done something wrong? Was it too cultural? Too emotional? Too much? But he just leaned against the piano and said, "I've been teaching here 23 years. I've heard a lot of talent. But last night, that wasn't just talent. That was truth." Paused. "If you're ever interested, I'd love to learn more about that instrument and that tradition." She blinked. "You would?" "I would," he said, smiling. "Music isn't just about notes. It's about stories. And yours mattered." After school, she finally worked up the courage to look at the video. It wasn't polished. The camera shook a little. The lighting wasn't perfect. But there she was, Moll, nervous, singing her heart out for a room full of strangers. And in the comments, people were saying things like, "This made me call my mom." "I didn't know music could feel like a hug." "Thank you for sharing your light." One comment stood out, "I lost my sister last year. I haven't been able to listen to music since." But this didn't hurt. It helped. She closed her laptop and sat back, stunned. She hadn't set out to help anyone. She'd only wanted to remember, to honor, to not forget her mother's voice. But in doing that, she'd given others permission to feel too. That weekend, her grandmother invited a few family friends over for tea. They'd all seen the video. They brought sweets, stories, and old songs of their own. One aunt started singing a lullaby in Punjabi. Another pulled out a dholak and began a soft rhythm. Before long, the living room was full of music, not performance, just sharing. Laughter mixed with memory, grief mixed with joy. She realized then that what she'd done wasn't just about her. It was part of something much bigger, a thread connecting generations, cultures, losses, and loves. And maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let that thread be seen. On Monday, school newspaper editor approached her between classes. "We'd love to do a feature on you," she said. "Not just about the song, but about why you chose to share it." "I don't want it to be about me," she said finally. "I want it to be about the song. About how music can hold us when nothing else can." The editor nodded. "That's exactly what we'll write." As the days passed, small things began to shift. The student council proposed adding a cultural heritage category to next year's showcase. A group of kids started a grief support circle that met during lunch quiet. No pressure, just space to talk or sit together. Even the school playlist in the gym got updated to include songs from different traditions. Not just top 40 hits. She didn't start any of it. But she'd opened a door and people walked through. One afternoon, she found a folded note in her locker. No name, just handwriting she didn't recognize. I didn't know it was okay to be sad and strong at the same time. Thank you for showing me." She tucked the note into her journal, right next to the lyrics of the song. She still sat in the back of class. She still spoke softly. She still preferred silence to crowds. But something inside her had changed. Not because people were watching, but because she'd finally let herself be seen exactly as she was, grieving, loving, remembering, trying, and in that honesty, she'd found a kind of freedom. That night, she'd practiced again. Not for an audience. Not for a showcase. Just for herself. Just for her mom. Just for the quiet joy of making something beautiful out of pain. And as the notes filled her room, she smiled, small, real, and steady, because now she knew she wasn't alone. And neither was anyone else who'd ever loved and lost. The song wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A week had passed since the showcase, and life at school had settled into something new, something quieter, more thoughtful. The buzz around the performance hadn't died down, but it had changed. It wasn't gossip anymore. It wasn't just about what she'd done on stage. It had become part of the air people breathed, like the way a room still holds warmth long after a fire has gone out. She walked through the halls now with her head just a little higher, not from pride, but from relief. Relief that she hadn't broken under the weight of her own silence. Relief that sharing her pain hadn't made her weaker, it had made her real. And in that realness, something unexpected had bloomed. Connection. But then came the email. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while she was doing homework at the kitchen table. The subject line read, "Congrats on your performance. National Youth Arts Initiative." She almost deleted it, thinking it was spam. But something made her click. Inside was a polite, well-worded message from a nonprofit that supported young artists from underrepresented backgrounds. They'd seen the video, someone had shared it with their regional coordinator, and they were deeply moved. They invited her to submit a short application to perform at their upcoming summer festival in Chicago. Travel, lodging, and a small honorarium would be provided. The theme this year, Voices That Heal. Her hands went still on the keyboard. Chicago, a real stage. A real audience, not just her town, but people who cared about art, about culture, about stories like hers. Her first thought wasn't excitement. It was fear. What if she couldn't do it again? What if it only worked that one time because her mother's presence had been so close? Because the grief was fresh, because the moment was perfect. What if she stepped onto that bigger stage and froze? Or worse, what if it felt empty this time, like performing a memory instead of living it? She didn't tell anyone that night, not even her grandmother. She just sat with the email open, reading it over and over, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. But the next morning, over chai and toast, her grandmother looked at her and said, "You got that email, didn't you?" She blinked. "How did you—" "I see your screen light on past midnight," her grandmother said gently, stirring honey into her cup. "And I know that look. You're not scared of the stage. You're scared of failing the song." The girl didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Her grandmother reached across the table and covered her hand with her own wrinkled. "Strong, warm. Your mother didn't sing that song to impress anyone," she said. "She sang it because it kept her heart soft when the world tried to make it hard. That's all you have to do. Keep your heart soft. The rest will follow." That afternoon, she filled out the application. Not because she was sure she'd get in, because saying no would have felt like closing a door her mother had left open. 2 weeks later, she got the acceptance letter. She read it in the school library during lunch, alone, at a corner table. When she finished, she pressed the printed page to her chest and just sat there for a long time. Eyes closed, breathing slowly. It wasn't join out exactly. It was something deeper, like being chosen not for talent, but for truth. The news spread fast. The principal announced it during morning assembly. The local paper wanted an interview. Her chemistry partner high-fived her in the hallway and said, "You're going national, huh?" She smiled but didn't feel like celebrating. She felt responsible because now it wasn't just her story. It was her mother's, her grandmother's, her whole lineage's, and she had to carry it. Well, preparation began quietly. She practiced every evening not to perfect the song, but to live inside it again. She added a new verse one her grandmother had taught her, about light returning after the longest night. She adjusted the harmonium's tuning, polished its wood with coconut oil like her mother used to do. She even recorded herself singing, not to critique, but to listen, really listen to whether her voice still held the same ache, the same love. One rainy Saturday, Mr. Daly, the music teacher, invited her to use the school auditorium to rehearse. "Get used to a real stage again," he said, "and I'll be your audience of one," she agreed. That afternoon, the auditorium was empty except for him, sitting in the middle of the fourth row with a thermos of coffee. She walked out, set up her harmonium, and began, halfway through. Her voice caught again, not from emotion this time, but from nerves. She stopped. "It's okay," Mr. Daly called out gently. "You don't have to be flawless. You just have to be you." She nodded, took a breath, and started over. This time, she didn't fight the tremor in her voice. She let it be there. And somehow, it made the song feel even more human. Afterward, he walked her to the parking lot. "You know," he said, "most people think performance is about showing off. But what you're doing, it's the opposite. It's about showing up fully, honestly. That's rare. And powerful." She thanked him, but his words stayed with her all the way home. As the festival date neared, the town began to rally around her in small, quiet ways. The diner put up a handmade sign, "Proud of our homegrown voice." A local tailor offered to hem her kurta for free. Her history teacher gave her a book on Sufi poetry for inspiration. Even kids who'd never spoken to her before said things like, "You've got this," or "We'll be watching online." But the biggest surprise came from the school counselor. She'd never been to counseling before. She wasn't at risk or struggling, at least, not in the way schools usually measured. But one day, the counselor asked if she'd be open to a short talk before the trip. They sat in a sunlit office with potted plants and soft chairs. No forms, no assessments. Just two people. "I just want to check in," the counselor said. "Big moments like this can bring up a lot, especially when they're tied to loss." The girl nodded. "I keep thinking, what if I go there and it doesn't feel the same? What if I'm just performing grief instead of living it?" "That's a really honest fear," the counselor said. "But grief isn't something you perform. It's something you carry. And you're not carrying it alone anymore. You've let others walk with you even if they don't know your mother's name." They talked for 20 minutes. Not about techniques or coping strategies, but about how love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes shape. And sometimes, singing is how we hold that shape in our hands. The night before she left for Chicago, her grandmother made her favorite meal, lentil stew, warm roti mango pickle on the side. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable quiet that only exists between people who know each other's hearts. After dinner, her grandmother brought out a small wooden box. Inside was a silver bangle, thin and delicate, with a tiny engraving inside. "Where you go, I have been. Where you stand, I stand with you." "This was your mother's," she said, slipping it onto her wrist. It fit perfectly. She wore it the first time she sang that song in public. At a community center in Mumbai. She was terrified too. The girl touched the bangle, feeling its cool weight. "Did she do okay?" Her grandmother smiled. She forgot 2 lines, but she kept singing. And afterward, an old man came up to her and said, "You reminded me of my daughter. Thank you for giving her back to me for 3 minutes." She paused. That's what matters. Not perfection, presence. The next morning, they drove to the train station before sunrise. The sky was pale pink, the air crisp with early summer promise. At the platform, they hugged tightly. "Sing for her," her grandmother whispered. "But also sing for you." She boarded the train with her harmonium in a padded case, her kurta folded neatly in her bag, and her mother's bangle gleaming on her wrist. Chicago was louder, taller, faster than she'd imagined. The festival was held in a riverside park, with stages tucked under strings of lights, food trucks lining the paths, and crowds that moved like rivers of their own. She checked into a small hotel room with 2 twin beds. She'd insisted on staying alone. Not because she didn't want company, but because she needed space to center herself. The night before her performance, she walked along the riverbank. The city lights shimmered on the water. She sat on a bench and closed her eyes, listening to the hum of traffic, the laughter of strangers, the distant sound of a saxophone playing somewhere down the path. And then, quietly, she began to sing just for herself. Just for the wind. She didn't know if anyone heard. But it didn't matter, because this time, she wasn't singing to be seen. She was singing to remember who she was and who she carried with her, back at the hotel. She laid out her white kurta on the bed. She polished the harmonium one last time. She checked the bangle on her wrist. Tomorrow, hundreds of strangers would watch her perform. Some would film it. Some would forget it by dinner. But a few, maybe just one, might hear their own story in her voice, and that would be enough. More than enough. It would be everything. The morning of the performance in Chicago dawned gray and drizzly. The kind of weather that makes everything feel softer, quieter. She woke before her alarm, already wide awake, heart beating like a slow drum in her chest. She didn't feel panic, just a deep, steady hum of readiness. Like a string tuned just right, she dressed carefully. The white kurta, freshly pressed, the black pants, the silver bangle her mother had once worn. She checked the harmonium, still in tune, still breathing its quiet wooden sigh when she pressed the bellows. She didn't rehearse. Not now. She'd lived with the song for weeks. It was part of her rhythm, like her breath or her pulse. The festival grounds were already buzzing when she arrived, vendors setting up tents, volunteers pinning badges, performers warming up in corners with violins, drums, spoken word. She found her assigned stage, a modest platform by the river, draped in simple fabric and lit by strings of warm bulbs. A staff member handed her a laminated name tag and gave her a kind smile. "You're on in 40 minutes. Take your time." She nodded and sat on a folding chair just off stage, watching people pass by, families with strollers, teenagers in colorful clothes, elders leaning on canes, artists carrying instruments that looked like they'd traveled across oceans. No one stared at her. No one knew who she was, and that felt like a gift. When her name was called, she walked on slowly, deliberately, the way she had back home, only this time. Her hands didn't shake. She set the harmonium on the stool, adjusted the strap, and looked out at the crowd. Not hundreds, but dozens, enough to fill the front 2 rows, with others drifting in as the music began. Some looked curious, some tired. Some were eating tacos from a nearby stall. It didn't matter. She wasn't here to impress them. She was here to honor what she carried. She began to play. The first notes floated out over the murmur of the festival, the drone of the harmonium, low and steady, like a heartbeat. Then her voice, soft at first, rose into the damp air. The same Sufi poem, the same words, but something was different now. It wasn't just grief this time, it was also peace. She sang about longing, yes, but also about return, about how love doesn't vanish, it transforms, how silence can hold as much meaning as sound. Her voice didn't crack this time, not because the pain was gone, but because she'd learned to carry it without letting it crush her. Halfway through, a little girl in the front row, maybe 6 or 7, stopped eating her ice cream and just stared, wide-eyed, as if she somehow understood every word. An older man with a weathered face closed his eyes and nodded slowly, like he was hearing a memory from his own childhood. A couple holding hands leaned into each other, not speaking, just listening. When she finished, there was a beat of silence, not awkward, but deep, like the world had taken a breath. Then applause, warm and steady, not thunderous like back home, but full of respect. Afterward, as she packed up, a woman approached. She had kind eyes and a scarf wrapped loosely around her shoulders. "My father used to sing that," she said quietly, "in Lahore. I haven't heard it since I was a child." She paused. "Thank you for bringing him back to me, even for a moment." The girl just said, "Thank you for listening." That was all it took. Over the next 2 days, she didn't perform again. But she stayed at the festival, wandering between stages. Listening to others share their stories, a poet from New Orleans reciting verses about her grandmother's kitchen, a dancer from Oaxaca honoring her ancestors through movement, a teenager from rural Iowa singing folk songs his great-grandfather taught him. She realized then that what she'd done wasn't unique. It was part of a much older human tradition, using art to keep the ones we love alive in our voices, our hands, our hearts. On the train ride back home, she felt tired but clear, like after a long walk through the woods. The city skyline faded behind her, replaced by fields and small towns blinking past the window. She opened her notebook and wrote one sentence. It's not about being heard, it's about being true. When she got off at her local station, she wasn't expecting anyone. But there, under the flickering station light, stood her grandmother, holding a paper bag of warm samosas. "You're home?" she said, hugging her tightly. "I am," the girl replied, and it felt like more than just a train trip ending. Back at school, things had shifted again, but this time in ways she hadn't planned. A group of students had started a new club, Voices Unheard. It wasn't just about music. It was about creating space for any kind of story that didn't fit the usual mold: poetry in native languages, family recipes shared as oral history, even silence honored as its own form of expression. They'd asked the administration to include a personal heritage slot in next year's spring showcase. To everyone's surprise, they'd said yes. Her chemistry partner now carried a small notebook where she wrote short memories of her late dog. A boy in her history class started bringing traditional instruments from his culture to show Anda, not as a performance, but as a way to connect. Even the quietest kids, the ones who never raised their hands, began to speak up in small ways, sharing bits of themselves they'd kept hidden for fear of not fitting in. And then came the school board meeting. She didn't plan to go, but Mr. Daly called her the night before. "They're voting on expanding the arts curriculum," he said. "They've asked you to speak. Just 5 minutes, which if you're willing." She almost said no, but then she thought of the little girl in Chicago, the woman who remembered her father, the students writing poems in notebooks. She thought of her mother's voice, carried across decades and oceans. She said yes, the night of the meeting. The auditorium was half full: parents, teachers, a few students. She stood at the mic, not in her kurta this time, just in jeans and a sweater, her harmonium resting at her feet. "I'm not here to ask for more concerts or better lighting," she began, voice calm. "I'm here to ask for more room for all of us to bring our whole selves to school. Not just the parts that are easy to understand or fit a certain idea of talent." She paused. Grief, joy, culture, memory, they're all part of who we are. And when we're allowed to share them, something beautiful happens. We stop feeling alone. She didn't sing. She didn't need to. Her words were enough. 2 weeks later, the school board approved a new cultural and personal expression pilot program. It included student-led storytelling nights, guest artists from diverse backgrounds, and training for teachers on how to create inclusive creative spaces. She didn't take credit. She just kept showing up. One afternoon, she found herself in the music room after school, not to practice, but to listen. Mr. Daly was teaching a small group how to play basic rhythms on hand drums. One of the students was the quiet boy who'd barely spoken all year. Now he was laughing as he tried to keep the beat. She leaned against the doorframe and watched. No one noticed her at first. Then Mr. Daly looked up and smiled. "Want to join?" he asked. She shook her head, just listening. And that was the point. She wasn't always the one singing anymore. Sometimes she was just part of the audience holding space for someone else's voice to rise. At home, things felt lighter too. She and her grandmother started recording old songs together on her phone. Not for anyone else, just for themselves. Her grandmother would hum a melody, and she'd try to match it on the harmonium. Sometimes they'd get it wrong. Sometimes they'd laugh until tears came. And sometimes in the quiet after a song, they'd just sit together, hands folded, hearts full. One evening, her grandmother asked, "Do you miss singing for people?" She thought about it. "Not really," she said. "I miss singing with people, like it's not a performance, it's a conversation." Her grandmother nodded. "That's how it's supposed to be." A month after Chicago, a message came from the festival organizers. A video of her performance had been shared with schools across the country as part of a Healing Through Art curriculum. Teachers were using it to talk about grief, identity, and courage with their students. She watched the video once, not to critique herself, but to see how far she'd come. The girl on screen looked small, uncertain, but her voice never wavered. And in that contrast, she saw her own strength. She didn't post about it. She didn't seek more stages. She just kept living, doing homework, eating dinner with her grandmother, walking to school with her head up but not high, just present. One day, a freshman stopped her in the hallway. "I signed up for the new storytelling night," she said shyly. "I'm going to read a letter I wrote to my brother who passed last year. I was scared, but then I remembered you." The girl smiled. "Tell him everything," she said. "He's listening." That night, she practiced again. Not for anyone. Not for any reason other than the joy of it. She sang the new verse her grandmother had taught her, the one about light returning. And as the notes filled the room, she realized something. She wasn't singing to remember her mother anymore. She was singing because her mother would have wanted her to keep going. And that, more than any applause, any video, any festival, was the real gift. Because healing isn't about moving on. It's about learning to carry love forward. And she was doing that, one note at a time. Time didn't stop after the festival. Life didn't freeze in some perfect, glowing moment. School still had pop quizzes. Homework still piled up. The bus was still late on rainy mornings. But something had shifted, not in the world, but in the way people moved through it. And especially in the way one quiet girl now walked through her days, not invisible, not loud, but steady. Present, real. Months passed, the seasons turned. Fall came with its crisp air and rustling leaves, and with it, the planning for the next spring showcase began. Only this time, it looked different. Posters around school didn't just say, "Sign up to perform." They also said, "Share a story, a tradition, a memory, a silence that speaks." Underneath, in smaller print, "All voices welcome."